Welcome to the Shema Podcast, the podcast for the perplexed, where Torah insights intertwined through personal stories as well as interviews with leading Torah scholars demonstrate the empowering qualities of Torah and mitzvot. For more great Torah learning through Torch, the Torah Outreach Center of Houston, go to torchweb.org. Now to the show.
Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Shema Podcast. And my friends, I do believe that this episode that I'm about to bring to you, not because of me, but because of my guest and the message that he is conveying on behalf of the Almighty, is going to be probably, I think, most impactful episode I have ever done.
I think you're supposed to say, but no pressure at this point, no?
Okay.
Yeah. This just me and the Almighty right here. We're collaborating. I think we should call it like Almighty and Myself Incorporated or something.
All right. So that is our guest, Jake Turx, and I'll set up like this before I get him on, and we really delve into what we're here to talk about, my friends. But what if I could tell you that the Almighty, who loves you very much, wanted to get a message to you in this point in time. He knew you'd be stressed about what's happened in the world since October 7th. The world doesn't make any sense. All of a sudden, the anti-Semitism has been on the rise, like what's happening? And he knew that. He knew in the year 2024, so many generations since Mount Sinai, so long in this exile, that you would need to hear this from him. So what did he do? He delivered a message to a very special prophet, which we will get into. And we discussed prophecy before, the ability back then of someone that was on a level that they could attach their consciousness from their physical self and go into worlds and see things and translate that message back to the Jewish people. But this prophecy, my friends, is very unique in that the Almighty wanted him to get it just right. So he gave him the Hebrew letters. He basically had the prophet dictate a letter to you to explain what is happening right now and to stay strong.
This prophecy was written 2,800 years ago. This is not something that was revealed to us right now. This is something that had already been recorded 2,800 years ago, exclusively for this year, for the events that are unfolding today. And it's a message of hope and a message of resilience. And at the same time, it shows us that there is a bigger script that is playing out, why it's playing out the way it is, and the meaning behind some of the biggest and most frightening world events that have been happening recently and how they all line up with the bigger picture.
Beautiful. Let's start, Jake, by telling the audience a little about yourself.
Okay. Hi, Dan. I am the senior White House correspondent for Ami Magazine. I'm a contributor to Newsmax, and I've been covering the White House this is my third presidential administration that I'm covering. So my whole approach to this was from a perspective, and you really have to be familiar with what's happening in the world to really understand and appreciate the prophecy. The better you know the news, the easier time you'll have understanding. Like when I study this prophecy with scholars who don't really follow the news, they don't pick up on it as easily as someone who might not be very learned but knows the news. So understanding what's going on in the world and having enough stake in it that you would feel stressed out is usually the target audience that not only understands this messaging best, but also for whom this messaging was written for in the first place. It's not written for the scholars that are studying all day who don't need this kind of reassurance. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I will say, Jake, that at the beginning, before I did the record button, you said, look, I'm not a rabbi, even though, trust me, from our vantage point, many of us, your level of learning, you're a rabbi. But you said, I don't want to come across like something that I'm not. But can you just accept maybe the possibility that the Almighty in his infinite wisdom said, I need to get this message out there. This prophecy has sort of settled in the text, and a lot of people aren't reading it. And I need to find the perfect person to convey this. Oh, Jake Turx, my humble servant, who is a reporter for a living, who is highly trained. And maybe I highly trained him in that profession, not for Ami Magazine, but for me, to
This
report
is
this
a
news for me.
yes.
Is that a possibility?
This is a very, very humbling idea for me to try to wrap my mind around. And this is not something that I can definitively say one way or another, as much sense as it does appear to make on paper.
Okay. I think the humility in knowing that the Almighty maybe chose us for something, but also knowing that, look, as Jews, we're all co-creators. And I think it's also empowering to everyone listening that everyone plays a unique role in completing the Almighty's creation and establishing, as we get close to Rosh Hashanah, the only election, my friends, that really matters is Rosh Hashanah, establishing the Hashem's kingship in this world, that everyone plays a unique role. So let's get into it, okay? Yeah,
Before we get in, I'm sorry, I just want to give a quick shout out to a mutual of ours, Shlomi Zions, who introduced us to each other, a local from your hometown, and a very dear friend of mine, and someone who is out there in the public eye, and he is making a Kiddush Hashem, not just passively, but proactively. He travels the world. He goes to Muslim countries dressed as a Hasidic Jew, and he goes out there to spread the love and the positive qualities of the Jewish people. And I cannot be any prouder of him. And so I want to give him a shout out. If you are not familiar with Shlomi Zions, look him up. He's very big on social media, and he's very inspirational. I think I would feel remiss if I didn't give him this little plug.
Thank you. I am so glad you did that. He made the connection, and we were so delighted in this community. We decided to make this his home. He is like the sweetest, bubbling with kindness guy in the world. Like, who else do you want, to be your emissary, to travel the world and represent the Jewish people? And Shlomi. I mean, that's exactly who we want. And I do also want to give a shout out too that, I came across you, Jake, through a podcast you did on the Kiddush Club that one of my listeners, David Block, forwarded to me. And I was not familiar with this podcast. Fantastic podcast. And that's where I heard you. And I reached out to Shlomi's fiance and I said, hey, would you make the connection? And, and my listeners, what I could have done, because I don't monetize this. I think they do. I think they run ads. I could have just got on and said, hey, check out this podcast. The link's below out, made my life simple. Yeah. But the reason I was like, you know what, I need to interview you myself is because my audience is, most of them are like me. They're Baal Teshuva. They didn't grow up learning. There was a lot of information that was assumed that people already know. Some of us don't got the Hebrew smarts real good. So I wanted to make sure all the messaging got broken down so it was able to be assimilated by every Jew listening, regardless of their background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like it's important for me to give a little bit of background about myself, that I just want to describe how I look. Okay, I am a Hasidic Jew. I have two very long side curls down the side of my head and an even longer frock that goes down to my knees. I've got a beard. I've got a kippah. I look as Jewish as Jewish can be. So, and I'm out there. I also do a lot of traveling. I meet all kinds of people. I'm exposed to all kinds of hate. I'm also exposed to all kinds of kindness. And for every anti-Semitic comment that I get, I'll probably get 20 to 25 philo-Semitic comments of people who tell me they're praying for Israel. They love the Jewish people. They're so concerned on our behalf. So being dressed the way I do, it raises the stakes on both sides. And what I've come to see is that as much as the negativity is what people see through media, through social media, there is so much more positivity that is being overshadowed. And I think it's very important to bring this point out there. There are more good people than bad people, and their friendship means everything to us. And it's important that they know that we do not take their friendship for granted. Over the past 11 months, we found out who our true friends are. And it's good to know who's on which side. And thank God, the people who are on our side are the people that we want on our side. Let them have all the creeps and losers and perverts. I'm fine with that. We got the good guys, and there are far more of us than of them. So that's just straight off the bat.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of this prophecy we're going to be discussing is speaking to the Western world. We've spoke about the exile of Edom a few episodes ago. Right? Ken Spiro spoke about it, Rome, Christianity, the Western world, but it's not a disparaging message to everyone in the Western world, like you said, because the majority are great. I have gotten nothing but just positive messaging ever since I started looking like a Jew, wearing my yarmulke, wearing my tzitzits out. I've had nothing but just amazing. Just the other day, I was in the car dealership getting some maintenance done, and a guy came up to me and said, I just want you to know that unlike what everyone's saying on the media, me and everyone I know, we totally support Israel. And I just want you to know that.
Exactly.
You hear stuff like that all the time. They are on our side. And I think that's what this whole trying time is right now, is Hashem sort of sitting back, correct me if I'm wrong, Jake, and saying, let's see what side you're on.
Correct. And I'll say even more. A lot of the anti-Semitism, especially the big platforms, they are unwittingly serving as agents of God to further this divine plan. Because if not for their hate against us, we would probably not be talking. We wouldn't feel the urgency of the situation as much. So what they're doing is they are raising an awareness, or rather they are kind of compelling us to try to understand our role in the world better through their negative, nasty actions. So in a sense, when you understand it from that point of view, and you see that essentially they're also part of God's bigger plan. They're not working under some other agency. They're not under like some Lucifer character. It is all part of the bigger picture. God is trying to kind of push us along to see what's happening and to try to understand why it's happening. When I see anti-Semitism, it doesn't even frighten me, because I'm aware of why it is part of the bigger picture. Now, for someone who's new to Judaism, this might sound, I don't know how this would come across, but this is how I sincerely approach the world. And this is why I'm not afraid to go out there, to put myself out there in the public, and to go to sometimes end up in neighborhoods as part of my work where someone looking like me wouldn't be so welcomed. But I also realize that these agents of God cannot harm me unless it was part of God's bigger plan, in which case it's part of the bigger picture. So I can't run away from it.
Well said. And I have found, and one of the things I've stressed since October 7th is that, a lot of Jews, I want to warn them against, is that the way to avoid all this anti-Semitism is just to take off the yarmulke, look like everyone else, assimilate. And that's just not the case. And I think what you said was very profound too, why the media platform that allows information to flow around the globe, hearing both sides of the argument. They hear this episode, they hear all the anti-Semitism. What is that doing? Well, the role of the Jew in the halakha we follow is to basically determine what is prohibited, what is permitted, what is holy, what is not holy. We know Hashem by knowing what is not Hashem.
Right.
And there's a prophecy, Jake, I've said many times on this podcast, from the Zohar, talking about the second great flood that would occur during the year in the Gregorian calendar of around 1840, where the world would be flooded with knowledge from above and below. And that technology is that medium, that knowledge from below, that allows the knowledge of Hashem to flood the world, which it is now. And we are clearly, through this platform, discerning what is holy, what is right, and what is wrong. Now choose your side. Would you agree with that?
Trivia question. What would you say was the most profound invention of the 1840s?
Oh, there was a printing press.
No, printing press was way earlier.
Oh, okay.
No, the answer, well, you're close, because it is about the written word, the telegram.
Oh, okay, right.
The telegram, the steam engine was a little before that, but the same era. But yes, the Industrial Revolution had been foreseen in the Zohar and had been, it kind of breaks it down almost to the year.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. All right. So explain to the audience the prophet that we're going to be discussing today, if you could.
All right. So Obadiah has the shortest prophecy, to the point that that's pretty much all people really know about him. He's the one who has the single chapter prophecy. It's a prophecy of 21 verses. And it is very short, it's very to the point. And if we would have been having this conversation 1 year ago, and you would have asked me to study the book of Obadiah with you, I would not be able to do it because most of the content therein would have not made sense in any context other than post-October 7th. Because in his very short single chapter, which is written about the eventual unraveling of the Edomite coalition, which, for background, all of the prophecies talk about two great coalitions that will be struggling for control over the Holy Land in the end of days. One being the coalition of Ishmael, which is understood to be the Arab world, and the other being the coalition of Edom, which is the Western world, which is Edom, Esau, and then eventually they intermarry with the aristocracy of Rome. They take over the Roman Empire. Rome embraces Christianity. Christianity spreads around the world, and you have Western civilization. So the two great powers and coalition of nations that are going to try through different strategies and tactics to gain control and influence over the Holy Land at the end of days are they're very clear. For example, like we know that China has no ambitions, no territorial ambitions over Israel. North Korea has no territorial ambitions over Israel. There are only two coalitions that do. And so this prophecy was said exclusively about the Edomite Western powers. It doesn't address the Arab component, though it does mention it euphemistically. Let's talk about who Obadiah was.
Yeah, let me ask you a quick
historically.
question, Jake. I'm
Okay,
just
go ahead.
something came to mind too. You know, these two dominant coalitions and the distinction between them and, let's say, China. Like China doesn't fit in, but is the reason they're not part of these opposing forces for the land of Israel is because China is an atheistic nation, and the other two have a sense of spirituality associated with them, with Christianity, even though it might not be accurate, and Islam?
You could say that, or you could say it in reverse, that because China never was never going to play a greater role vis-a-vis territorial claims to Israel, it made sense for them to adapt an atheistic worldview. So this way they are removed from the conflict.
Okay, gotcha.
But either way, it's part of the bigger picture.
Right.
There are no, I mean, every individual alive today is either an actor or an extra or a spectator of what is unfolding right now. And the prophecy of Obadiah is the most precise, but there are also other prophecies that talk about what is going on in the world today in very clear terms, using words that no other generation would have been able to understand or make sense of, but we understand what it means because it was written for us.
Wow. Okay.
Like I'll give you just a few quick examples. It references the Houthis, the warriors of Yemen. It references a catastrophic event against the Jewish people using the word Hamas, which is translated by the ancient translators, the Aramaic translators from 2,000 years ago, as kidnappings, abductions.
Wow.
That there will be this phenomenon of abductions against the Jewish people known as Hamas. So, and it describes October 7th in very vivid detail. And then it talks about how the West should not react after this October 7th Hamas phenomenon. But we see that they pretty much violated every single warning that the prophet told them not to do. And then it talks about the punishment that these Western nations will be meted out as a result of this. However, it also is very clear from the commentaries that what's playing out now had already been predetermined thousands of years ago. These are ancient battles that are coming to the fore at a very strategic time. Abstract, right?
Right. Wow.
So now let's try to make a little bit more sense of it. So I'm going to invite anyone who has a book of the prophets, the 12 prophets, Trei Asar, Obadiah is found there, or if you have a Chumash, the Haftorah of the week of Vayishlach is when we read the book of Obadiah, which incidentally, the week of Vayishlach is the same week that the Western coalition declared war against the Houthis in Yemen before fleeing in panic, which is what the prophet says is going to happen. So let's get into it. All right, you ready?
Okay.
Or is there anything that still needs to be tied up first?
Now, I believe what I learned, there was another text with commentary on this prophecy that you came across. Did I hear that correctly from you? Because I know that sort of opened your eyes. Let's start there and talk about who wrote that commentary, when they wrote it, and how this amazing story you told about how you came across this text. And then I think that will set a nice foundation to actually get into the text of the prophecy.
Okay. So one of the early Hasidic masters who was known to, who many stories are told of his ability to see the future and to know things that were happening in parts of the world that he had never been to. He's known by one of his works, the Sefer Bnei Yisachar, which is the descendants of the tribe of Issachar. That's the name of his magnum opus. He's written many other works, some of which are better known than others. But shortly before his passing, he wrote a commentary on the book of Obadiah. And this is the only commentary that he's written on any of the books of the prophets. He wrote this a short while later, he passed away. And it was something that wasn't really well known because it's a single short little pamphlet with commentary on just a single chapter. You know, where do you put that? Had he written about like multiple books of prophets, then, you know, it would make it into a single volume or maybe multiple volumes, but at least it would have somewhere where to stand. But when you write about a topic, a very short topic, and you're only writing about one book of the topic, and it just happens to be something that at the time people don't really relate to, then it just gets lost. And so this was a commentary that I'd never heard of, and most of the people I spoke to had never heard of it. And when I say most of the people, I'm talking about people who collect ancient books, people who are familiar with the Hasidic masters of yesteryear.
What year did he live?
He lived in the early to mid 1800s.
Okay.
Or maybe rather actually late 17, early 1800s. I believe he passed away before the Industrial Revolution, and he wrote about it. He wrote about how in the end of days, all of the knowledge, like the overwhelming amount of knowledge in the world, will be monopolized by the West. The inventions, the innovations, the advancements will all be from the Edomite nations. And he wrote this before it actually started happening. So that's just one example of something that he had already foreseen. But then within his commentary, and the name of the work is Kalei Haroyim, which translates into a vessel for those who see beyond. He has a lot of very deep concepts, Zohar, Kabbalah, stuff that I don't understand, that I'm not qualified to understand. But between all of those really deep concepts, he has a few very easy to understand basic predictions about the future where there was no way he could have just guessed it or made it up. He writes it so definitively, and we see how it is playing out in real time. And that really sealed the deal for me, that this prophecy was written exclusively for this year. So I think we should jump into it. What do you say?
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, so we're going to start from verse 1, 21 verses. I'll try to go through this as quickly, but also as concisely as possible.
Right.
So, Chazon Ovadia, Koamar Hashem. This is a vision that Obadiah saw and simultaneously heard from God. Koamar Hashem Lakim, so said Hashem, our Lord, Edom, regarding the Edomites. And Shemur Shemanu Me'es Hashem. This is something that other prophets had also heard about. So he's not the only prophet that prophesied about Edom, but he's the only prophet who was able to see the full prophecy to its completion. Because when God tried showing the prophecy to all of his other prophets, Jeremiah, for example, is one of them, one of the prophets that God tried showing the vision to, none of the prophets were able to get to its end because of how powerful and profound the prophecy was. The only one who was able to fully comprehend it was Obadiah. And the reason is because he was a convert, an Edomite convert to Judaism. And he represented the good qualities of Edom. And God said, let a righteous Edomite prophesy about the destruction of the evil of Edom. So it is very clear from the prophecies that the evil qualities of Edom will be destroyed and the positive qualities of Edom will live on. So there is going to be this conflict within Edom of the good and the evil qualities, and the good qualities of Edom will shine forth, and they will be complemented by their alliance with the Jewish people. But first, the evil has to be eradicated. He says, so Vitzir B'Goyim Shulach. It will be a time where it'll appear as if a memo had been sent around to the nations that says, Kumu, get up, v'nakumu alei lamochama, and let us avenge ourselves against them in battle. It'll be a time when the empire of Edom will appear extremely vulnerable, and all the nations will say, let us exact our revenge against Edom for whatever grievances we may have had from years past, or let's just take advantage of the situation. So now God takes a step back and he says, now listen, Edom, you started as humble origins among the nations. You were greatly despised. The empire of Edom at its founding, they didn't have a unique language. They didn't have their own alphabet, their own writings. They mooched off of other nations. And so they didn't really produce anything at the time. But then when they intermingled with the Roman Empire, and then eventually they became the aristocracy of Rome, suddenly they were catapulted to the greatest heights, the peak of civilization, coming from a lowly, unacknowledged nation that never contributed anything to suddenly take over the entire Roman Empire at its peak. So now God says, Zedoin libcha hishiacha, your sinful heart led you astray, because you thought, you were born into this civilization at the top of a mountain, and you look down from your lofty perch, and Omer Beliba, you said to yourself, Mi yarideni aretz, look at this powerful civilization that I've been born into. Surely nobody can bring me crashing down to earth. No one can take this all away from me. But God's like, you haven't considered how you got there. You haven't considered the fact that I put you there for a specific reason. It wasn't your brilliance or your greatness. It wasn't luck. I made you the most powerful coalition in the world as part of my grand plan. So, and this next verse is so unmistakably precise. When you understand the words of verse 4, you realize that there's no way someone writing this 2,800 years ago would have been able to know this had he not been shown this in a vision, had he not literally seen the year that we live in. So verse 4 says, Im tagbia kanesher, though you will rise up like an eagle, and you will establish bases among the stars. Misham ayritchan om Hashem. When you are at the peak of your power, that you have a space force, and you have bases among the stars, precisely then, at the height of your power, I will bring you back down to earth and destroy your power and your might. So when is this memo going around to the nations that Edom is vulnerable? It'll happen when you're at your most powerful. At the peak of your power is when these rumors will be going around that your destruction is imminent. And it will be done so that in a way that will be unmistakable. Not that, oh, look, the empire was falling apart already. No, it'll be at the peak of your power. Any questions so far? Anything that needs further clarification?
Can you tie that into what you see happening in the world today with the world Western powers, United States, Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. That is going to be addressed in verse 15 and 16.
Okay.
We'll get to that.
We'll get there. Okay, fantastic. Continue.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the word that is used, I want to go back to verse 3. The word that he uses to describe the peak of power is Maroim Shiftoi. Maroim Shiftoi meaning the most exalted peak of civilization. However, what this Sefer Klei Aroim points out is he says the word Maroim, which means exalted, is really a play on the word Rome. So he was predicting the Roman Empire as being the peak of Edomite power. So the word that he uses to describe peak civilization is the word Rome. And so he says that this is a specific reference to the Roman Empire and the Roman Empire's collapse. So this is a reference of events that had already occurred, that happened in the past. To us, it happened like we're talking about the Byzantine Empire collapsed like what, 700-800 years ago. The Roman Empire collapsed like a few hundred years before that. That had already happened, but he's talking in general terms that even the peak of the Roman Empire is going to come to an end. And similarly, the end of days, Edom will be even more powerful than it was at the time of the Roman Empire. And they will attain this power so that they can be brought down in a very humiliating and also in a very unmistakable manner. All right?
Got it. Okay. And I've talked a lot too on this podcast about when you look around the world today, you look around the United States, is it more heavily influenced by the Jewish people? To some degree, yes. But mostly it's been influenced by Rome, where everything's centered on physicality, the body. It's Greek philosophy that permeates, the vastness of everything that we experience, being in the United States.
Correct. So it is the Western ideals that, or rather the negative qualities of the West that is being addressed over here, which is also very similar to the negative qualities of the Roman Empire, as well as the personal character traits of Esau, who was the founder of the Edomite Empire, who was our ancient uncle, the brother of Jacob, who the elder brother of Jacob, who was supposed to be the one who would inherit the land of Israel, but who through his own actions in his lifetime squandered it all, and he's never gotten past it. So
that's why I wanted you on to, Jake, right now, because last episode or 2 episodes ago, we had Rabbi Ken Spira on to talk about the sibling rivalry between Esau and Ishmael. So this is perfect. The audience is primed for this message right now.
And there is nobody better to break down in very easy to understand terms this whole dynamic than Rabbi Ken Spiro. So this makes my job so much easier. And if any of the listeners hadn't heard that episode yet, it would be very valuable for you to go back and give it a listen. Okay, verse 5. So now he kind of describes in vague terms, the real prophecy begins in verse 8, but he kind of goes over in vague terms how this destruction is going to be brought about. And there are parallels between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the collapses that we're seeing within Western civilization. So he says, Im ganavim bo'olach, suppose you have thieves who they attack your property, okay? Im shoydedai laila, or let's say they're marauders. The difference being that thieves, they'll come quietly. Marauders, they'll come making noise, banging pots with pitchforks and torches. And so whether it's the thieves that come silently or the marauders that come at night, there's one thing that they all have in common, and that is, haloi yignavu dayam. Wouldn't it be plausible that they would take as much as they can carry, and then they'll be gone, right?
Right.
And then he throws in the word eichmed mesa, which is, in a sense, it's an interjection of like, how could you have been so spaced out while all this is happening? There will be the silent thieves that will infiltrate civilization, and at the same time, there'll be these marauders running around making noise, as Trump would probably say, eating the dogs, eating the cats, and all this is happening, and you're just sleeping. You're sleeping right through it. How could this most brilliant empire in the history of mankind how could they have been so clueless to all of this infiltration that's happening by powers that hate them, that are seeking to destroy them? And we see this playing out in Europe more than anywhere, but I think
Even here.
Americans can identify with this as well.
Yeah, my friends who are very into U.S. politics you have their attention now, because it's the same thing they're telling me about.
You're in Texas. You're on the forefront of all this.
Right,
I'm sorry for doxing you, but so
yeah,
now
go continue.
He says they'll look, a thief. He'll steal your PlayStation. He might take your exercise bike if he needs it. He'll take some bling. He'll take some cash lying around. Maybe he'll take some documents so he can steal your identity. He'll take what he can use, and then he'll be off. They're not sticking around to get caught by the cops, right?
Right.
So, and now he says, and even if, let's say, they come by daytime in Beitzer, let's say they come dressed up as harvesters. You know, they're kind of like, hey, no, we're just coming to pick the grapes. We're hired, you know.
Right.
They will still leave behind the unripe grapes. Like they'll leave behind the small little grapes that are obscured by leaves or that are not ripe yet, so they have no reason to pick them. And then they'll come back in a few weeks and they'll steal those as well. But they're going to leave something behind. He says, however, how thoroughly the deepest, most hidden treasures and deepest secrets will be exposed through this process. Meaning that the people who are going to bring about the destruction of this Edomite empire, these infiltrators, they're not coming to steal our goodies. They are coming to destroy and wipe out. They're not interested in building a civilization. They're coming only to destroy Western civilization. And look around the nations that are at the forefront of the struggle right now. Look at the European nations, and you see this playing out. You see their neighborhoods are being taken over by people who are not looking to use the Western advancements to further their own civilizations. They're looking to destroy the Western advancements so that they can replace it with their own 7th century worldview.
Where do you see this happening most currently?
France, Germany, Sweden, the UK.
I had earlier this year a gentleman on who, with the intelligence of the IDF, trying to get a message out there that the reason the foreign powers are not supporting Israel is because they have such a large Muslim population that's why they're making such a big deal about it, because Jews don't go we don't go out and burn down buildings and storefronts if we don't get our way, if they don't treat Israel right. But they're trying to appease their Muslim population because it's becoming such a large part of their population. I think that's what you're hinting at here with these foreign European nations.
Correct. And to be very clear, we're not talking about the moderate Muslims, because the moderate Muslims are more at risk than any of us. They're the ones who have been genocided by the radical elements of Islam. And even if they're a minority or a very small minority, they're really the only minority that matters. Because if 90% is peaceful and they're being threatened by the same 10% that we're all being threatened by, that is the challenge right now. So this is not about any particular religion or culture or nationality. It's about the very dominant minority that is powerful enough to destroy any nation, especially because the moderates are not in a position to be able to stand up to them.
Okay, great.
Being that the moderates feel most threatened by them more than any of us. So they really have to. So it could be a small percent, but that's really all that matters. That's the percent that's significant.
Okay.
All right. So then the last verse before the prophecy says that you're going to be stabbed in the back by nations that you thought you could count on. So the nations that you're at peace with are going to escort you up until the border. They will mislead you, and they will mislead you into thinking that they're supporting you because of, and as the commentary here explains, because of everything that you had done for them over all the years, will make you think that they're on your side too. And they'll say that they're on your side. But when you're at the border, when you're at your most vulnerable, they will abandon you. And this is despite all the foreign aid that we, the most benevolent nation in the history of the world, without any parallel, the United States of America, is going to find itself being stabbed in the back by the very nations that it had spent so much time trying to help cultivate and provide aid for and rescue operations whenever there was some kind of a natural catastrophe. Those nations are not going to be there for the West when it matters most.
Okay.
Okay. Lachmecha yasimu mazar tachtecha ein tevuna bay. Lachmecha means your bread. And your bread could mean, it could be understood in various ways. Different commentaries offer different explanations. But I believe the common theme is those nations that until previously weren't good enough for you to even sit down and break bread with. The ones that you wouldn't even share a table with them. Like you'll tolerate them, but you wouldn't feel comfortable even inviting them into your house. They will be embedded as some kind of a parasite within you. The word parasite, mazar, I'm translating it as parasite just based on the context. The literal translation is they will serve as a snare below you. They will kind of like a snare trap, and they'll do it from below in a way that you don't see it until it's too late, and then they will replace you eventually. And ein tevuna bay means either that this nation will be a nation without knowledge, the usurpers will be people who haven't contributed anything to civilization. And alternatively, it could be understood as, hey, tevuna bay, you will have no insight into what's happening until it is too late. All right? So,
right. Sobering.
With all of that, yes. So this is not the sobering part yet. These are just some generalities about Edom and Esau. And these 7 verses appear in the prophecy of Jeremiah, like almost identical. So these 7 verses, and some of the commentaries explain that really the prophecy begins from verse 8. The first 7 verses are there for background. Verse 8 till the end is 15 verses that break down. It's suddenly the whole style of writing changes. It suddenly switches into a sequential storyline. So here's how that goes.
Okay.
Verse 8. It will be on that day, so says the Lord. Which day is this? This is the day, the point of no return, from when the empire of Edom will reach its downward spiral from which it will not be able to climb out. And so he says the first 2 things you should look out for. How do we know when this day is? He says, suddenly, there will be a shortage of wise leaders among the nations of Edom, and the knowledge will abruptly cease to be disseminated from the coalition of Esau. Coalition of Esau being another name for the nations of Edom. Har typically Har means the mountain of, but the Bnei Yissaschar's commentary says that here Har means the coalition of. And so my understanding of what the coalition refers to is if you break down the gematria of the word Har, you have the numerical value of, and it's 2 letters, Hey, which is, what's the numerical value of Hey?
5.
Yes. And Reish, what's the numerical value of Reish? So Reish is 200.
Okay.
200. Okay. So what is the significance of 205 in this context? The coalition of Esau. The UN represents 196 nations, and then a few unrecognized territories like observer states. So they represent about 200 nations, and then they have 5 nations that have veto power above the 200. So when I see something like that, this is speculation on my part. Everything else that I said is sourced by commentaries, but this is something that is my own intuition, because the Bnei Yissaschar says that is going to that Har doesn't mean mountain, it means coalition, And I look at the numerical value and I say it is very clear that this is referring to the UN, because the UN is the ultimate ESA coalition. It is a coalition of all nations. However, the only nations with veto power are ESA nations. None of the Ishmael nations have veto power. And China is just China's China. They're neither side. But it is exclusively ESA. It is territorially always been in, you're talking about whether it's Geneva, whether it's San Francisco, the original base, and now New York City, it is all Edom. So my understanding is that it is referring to the United Nations and their various proxies, UNRWA, etc.
Right. I think everyone can agree that the wisdom has vanished from that coalition.
Yes, and listen, look at the academia. At around the same time that everybody was looking at, by the way, let's get this out of the way, right?
Okay.
The epitome of the coalition of Edom is clearly the United States for a few reasons. Because A, it is the biggest Christian country by far. Mm-hmm. By far. The second biggest Christian population is in India, which is not a Christian nation at all. So it is the biggest Christian country. It is also the most influential, most prosperous Christian nation. And
we host it.
And we host the UN, and it kind of sets the pace for everything else. So at the same time that you see that the leadership of the West is suddenly without any knowledge, you're also going to see that their academic system, Tavuna, their knowledge base, is going to cease to disseminate knowledge to the rest of the world. And we've been seeing both of these playing out at the same time. I'm watching the recent debate between Trump and Kamala Harris. Mm-hmm. And I mean, not watching, I was there, in Philly as a member of the press. And I'm thinking back to the debates from, all of the debates until recently, where you had people who were just boring talking points, vanilla copy-paste politician type. Right. And here you have people just proverbially throwing feces at each other.
Yeah.
It's we went from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to Idiocracy in just like a few short steps, right? Yeah. So
enough said. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
When you see
the analogy,
the wisdom will vanish from Edom. That's all I kept thinking about was just the U.S. political debates over the last. Now I have some people that are fans of certain ones, but I think that's just a sign of a deep exile when your idea of a leader, which should be King Moshiach, has dwindled down in desperation to Trump or Harris. I mean,
so look, you know what? There are a lot of positive aspects to Trump and a lot of positive aspects to Harris. And as someone who's gotten to know them, who's spoken to them, I understand the concern that people have of either candidate. I also understand what excites people about both candidates. And at the same time, speaking to their reporters, there are very few people who would admit, who wouldn't admit that these are not the best and brightest cast of characters that have. Look, Trump has done a lot of good things in his life, a lot of bad things in his life. He doesn't strike you as the most polished, most savvy politician type.
Individual.
Yeah, which a lot of people appreciate about him.
Sure.
At the same time, he's not being described as being necessarily wise. And Harris and her word salads don't really serve her well either in that regard. Right. And then Joe Biden, we don't even have to talk about Joe Biden because I think we've all witnessed the deterioration of Joe Biden.
Well, I think there's a verse coming up that discusses Joe Biden.
Yes.
Okay, we'll get there.
That doesn't discuss Joe Biden per se, but that describes an event that is unmistakable tied to Joe Biden, at least the way I understand it.
Okay.
So then he says, so at the same time, when the wisdom and wise leaders of Edom are both being downgraded very perceivably, when this happens, look out for the next two immediate world events that will be happening at around the same time. So the first thing he talks about is a conflict between the Western coalition and the warriors of Yemen. And so I'm going to read the verse and then I'm going to explain what it means based on various commentaries like the Malbim and others. V'chatu giberecha Teman, your warriors will panic on account of Yemen. Alternatively, it can be read as your warriors will panic and will flee south, which both tie in exactly what has been playing out over the past few months. And the interesting thing here is that the word that he uses, he could have used the word, he could have said, you'll be demolished, obliterated, destroyed, wiped out, annihilated. I mean, there's so many words that he could have gone with. The word he went with is, you will be panicked. And the Hebrew word for you will be panicked is, or more specifically, is you will be cut down by. And cut down by is translated by the commentators to mean you will be panicked into fleeing. The word is, the way I would pronounce it, my Hasidic Polish pronunciation would be vechati, which is not only is it the same letters, but it is pretty much the same pronunciation even as the word vechuti. So it says these Houthis, warriors of Yemen, will be the ones that will cause you to panic and you will flee south. I'm tying three different commentaries into mean the same thing, that there's three different explanations which all build on each other. And I can send you a screenshot if you want of a map of where all the U.S. naval ships are stationed presently in the Middle East. And you'll see that there is nothing around Yemen at this point, because they all fled, and the direction in which they were forced to flee was south, because that's the only way to get out of to get into the Indian Ocean, to get out of the narrow strait over there,
right?
And to get out. So you'll see there's a big concentration of ships in the Persian Gulf, a big concentration in the Mediterranean, but there is nothing near Yemen, because we kind of declared war at Yemen. We had a coalition of nations, mostly European, like one or two Middle Eastern, and that entire coalition they fired a few cruise missiles and then they booked. And right. So it says that Lemani Kares Ish Mehar Esav Mikato, that the Western coalition will panic at the thought of a slaughter and will flee as a result. Now, whether it's they'll be afraid of their own slaughter, or they'll be afraid that any slaughter that is brought upon the people of Yemen will reflect poorly on the West. And so either way, they will avoid this conflict. Now, this wasn't a major significant event on a world stage, as far as we know. When you look at the war in Ukraine, which I think everybody would say the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza way overshadows anything that, the Houthis just landed a rocket in central Israel over Shabbos. That's nothing compared to the 20,000 missiles fired by Hezbollah, right? So right. It doesn't seem like a significant storyline, but it essentially really is, because this is the first time that the West declared war on someone, but then fled in panic instead of actually engaging. And what this did is this gave it kind of reinforced the memo that spread around the nations back from verse 1 that Edom is vulnerable. Although they are currently at the peak of their power, they are vulnerable, and now is the time to take advantage. And we see it playing out with North Korea. We see it playing out with China. We see it playing out with the alliance now between Russia and Iran. We see it playing out in so many ways. So many nations saying, all right, now is our chance to do what we wanted to do, because Edom is vulnerable. And we see this all over the world. We see this in Africa. We see this a little bit now in South America with Venezuela, Guyana, where everybody is saying now is the time, whatever grievances we've had, now is the time to take advantage, because the West is unable to insert themselves or stand in the way. So why is the West being dealt this humiliating blow? And so the next verse addresses this question. Mechamas achicha Yaakov, on account of this phenomenon known as Hamas, that you will instigate against your brother Jacob, i.e. the Jewish people, your punishment will be techas chabusha. you will be engulfed and overwhelmed with humiliation, and you will be cut down forever, meaning that your credibility will be forever tarnished and you will not recover from it. And so what is this mechamas? As I alluded to earlier, you look in the translation, the Targum Yonasan, the definitive translation of the prophets, and he translates the word Hamas as chituf. Chituf literally means abductions. In Hebrew, the hostages are known as the chitufe Gaza, the abductees in Gaza.
Okay.
Right? So now there are other places in the Bible where the word Hamas is used in various contexts. And there, the translation is always about thievery. It's about a breakdown of civilization. It means different things. It's a word that was used variously in the times of Noah before the flood. But there, the translation is never abductions. This is a very rare, unique translation where he says the word Hamas means abductions, a phenomena of abductions that will occur in the end of days, that will have been instigated by the West. And so this is the first passage that caught my eye in this Bnei Yissaschar's commentary, Klei Aroyim, and I said this on the other podcast, where he says that the way the Edomites operate is they operate deceitfully. They'll sick one nation against another and then pretend like they had nothing to do with it. They're always involved in every conflict, but they always pretend like they have plausible deniability. They always have a patsy. And so he says, this played out by the destruction of the first temple when they pretended to be our buddies, and then they tracked us down to, like, while we were escaping the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, they used their proximity to us to take down information on where our refugees were fleeing, and then they passed all that along to the Babylonians so that they could wipe us out. And similarly, they played a very similar role by the destruction of the second temple, where they were directly involved, but they pretended that it wasn't really them. However, in those two eras, we were so beaten and downtrodden, we were fleeing for our lives in all directions, we weren't able to publicly expose them and hold them to account. Right. So he says that in the end of days, a very similar event will play out, where it won't be about the destruction of the temple, but it will be about the liberation of Jerusalem. And once again, Edom will be instigating this whole event from behind the scenes. However, this time they will be exposed publicly and they will be held to account.
Okay.
And so go ahead. What's your question?
I was going to say, can you, for my listeners may be aware of this, I'm not, but I assume you're going to draw on some connection, because we're obviously talking about October 7th, hostages taken, but Edom, or the United States, being somehow involved in inciting that. Right.
Okay. And let me tell you something. This is something that I had been aware of for the past for over 3 years, and I didn't even know what to do with this information, because it wasn't like, before the attack happens, you could be aware of something, but you can't really talk about it, because then you just sound like some kind of a conspiracy theorist who's just saying random nonsense. After the fact, it's a lot easier to show how all those dots connect. Okay. So the first, probably best way that, and by the way, the answer to your question is in the next verse. Okay. I'm just giving specific, I'm giving some specific background here that not a lot of people are aware of, that as soon as people are made aware of it, it causes them to see it all in a whole different light. Sure. So I want to say, just for his credit, no president has been as supportive of Israel in a time of war as Joe Biden, period, not even close, probably more than all other presidents combined. If you look at, Nixon with the Yom Kippur War, he's up there as one of the biggest supporters of Israel, but he also put a lot of conditions. And then as soon as the war was over, that support kind of vanished. And then they had to start with Ford from scratch. You look at both Bush presidents, where they, you had the first intifada, the second intifada, Bush, Reagan, they didn't allow Israel to do almost anything. And here, the Biden administration is allowing Israel to do whatever they feel is necessary to protect themselves. So this is not to disparage the billions of dollars of weapons that Biden has been sending and the moral support and the fact that he's gone down there and he's met with the families and he's invited families of hostages to meet with him.
Absolutely.
This is not to take any of this away from him. At the same time, this entire war was unnecessary and avoidable had he not sent the insane amounts of money that he did to Hamas proxies that ended up giving it directly to Hamas. And by Hamas proxies, specifically UNRWA and other Palestinian agencies. And we found out in recent weeks that all of the money coming into UNRWA, 25% of it went straight to Hamas as a tax. And we know what Hamas did with all of the monies that they received. They didn't use it to build roads and bridges.
Right, for sure. Well, they built the infrastructure of tunnels. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Now, I have a statement that the administration released 16 days before October 7th, where they said, now, sorry, let me take a step back. Donald Trump, when he became president, he cut all funding to the government and to the various Palestinian entities, because he rightfully pointed out that a lot of these funds were going directly to terrorist families, the pay to slay, where if you had a family member that committed a terror attack in which Jews died, you are eligible to a certain stipend from the Palestinian Authority. And Trump said, until you guys eliminate all of these practices, we're not sending you any more aid. And what we saw during the Trump years, the average number of rockets that were fired at Israel was between 600 and 800 per year, 600 and 800 rockets per year. Over the past year alone, we've already seen more than 20,000 rockets fired at Israel. And the years preceding that, there were approximately 2,000 rockets per year, the first 3 years of the Biden presidency. And here, year 4, 20,000. What changed?
So you're saying the United States is funding this?
I'm not going to say that. I'll let the United States say that. 16 days before October 7th, the U.S. ambassador to the UN released a statement that essentially said, we've just appropriated another $73 million to the Palestinian territories, which brings our total funding to the Palestinian people to $1 billion since the start of the Biden presidency. $1 billion. And then a week before October 7th, the Secretary of State released a statement where he said that they had appropriated, on top of those 73 million, an additional 75 million. Okay? These are in the days leading up to October 7th. And we also saw the National Security Advisor get up there and say, 2 weeks before October 7th, say how the Middle East has been so quiet that they're not even focusing on it. So who were the three biggest financial backers of Hamas? Those would be the United States, the European countries, the European Union, and the third place you would have Iran at a very insignificant 150 to 300 million estimate, which pales in comparison to what the other nations have been sending, the Western nations, that is. But where did Iran have all of those funds to be able to appropriate to Hamas? Because we unfroze billions of dollars that had been frozen. We essentially just gave them all of this cash, which was their cash, but it had been frozen. They weren't able to do anything with it. And as soon as we unfroze it, suddenly the Houthis built themselves up, and Hamas is getting hundreds of millions from these funds that the West made available. So not that they wanted this to happen, not that they planned this to happen, but they lost their ability to think critically about cause and effect. Their wisdom has been extinguished. And some of the commentaries explain that the wisdom, they'll have a powerful military, but they're not going to remember how to prosecute a war successfully. They're not going to know how to strategize effectively. They're not going to know how to assimilate the information in front of them in a productive, gainful manner. Okay. Now, Edom asks the same question that you asked, which is, but wait a second, that was Hamas. Why are you looking at me? We didn't do anything. Plausible deniability. So the next verse answers this in an unmistakable way. It says, this already goes back to the first day that you stood against him. And he says, wait, what day was that? He says, on that day when foreigners captured his multitudes, and strangers broke down his gates, and they framed the entire conflict on the liberation of Jerusalem, the liberation of Al-Quds, the Al-Aqsa flood. That was the name of the operation, was the liberation of Jerusalem operation, essentially. From that very first day, God had already known that you were, based on your heart, that you were really on their side. Again, this is not talking about individual Westerners. It's talking about the policies of the Western governments will make it abundantly clear that you were supporting this Hamas phenomenon against the Jewish people.
Okay.
Okay. So now he's going to go into a bunch of warnings, what they shouldn't do in the immediate aftermath of this. He says, don't scrutinize your brother's actions following this day of estrangement. And also, it bears pointing out that he keeps on referring to this Hamas phenomenon as a single day event. And not only was it a single day event, October 7th, it is known by its single dayness of the event. It's like 9/11 was a one-day event. October 7th is known as, 6-Day War was a 6-day event. October 7th was the one-day event. So he keeps on talking about on the day of. Very unmistakable that this Hamas phenomenon of abductions will take place on a single day, which will feature strangers and foreigners breaking down the doors. And of course, they claim Israel as theirs. But essentially, and not to get lost in the history rabbit hole of it all, the claims are not only not very well documented, but most of these families are not even from the region. As like one of the most common last names in Gaza is Al-Masri, which means the Egyptian, literally the Egyptian. Hi, we're the Egyptian family, and we claim Israel as ours historically, right? It is so laughably absurd. But let's not get into the history of it, because then we could do a whole podcast on that itself. Like we could just have our own show together.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay.
What does it mean that to gaze with glee? Because it's not like the United States was.
So the way I understand it is don't scrutinize rather than gaze, because glee is the next one.
Okay.
Glee is al tismach levnei Yehuda. Don't rejoice inwardly at the plight of the Judeans b'yom avdam, on their day of loss. And as I've pointed out, the entire October 7th, if you look at the biblical portions of the land of Israel, the entirety of the October 7th attacks took place in the portion of Judea, Judah's portion. The furthest extent that Hamas got to was Ofakim, which is the border between Judah and Shimon, but they were not able to break out of Judah. And so, again, this is further reinforcement that he saw all this, and he's describing this using very specific terms that are unmistakable. So he says, don't rejoice when the children of Judea on their day of loss, don't rejoice over that. My understanding is of the first part, don't scrutinize, is don't over-exaggerate every little action that they need to take as a means of ending this war. And just don't hold them back. Let them do what they have to do, and don't look so closely. Don't judge them on a metric that you wouldn't hold yourself to. Like this is a double standard that Israel has to always answer to. That the Western nations, when they go to war, never have to contend with. Sure. So he's saying, let them do the job, and then don't rejoice inwardly, which is only something that God could know. And he says this, that he knows that they were rejoicing. Them being enough of the Western governments were secretly rejoicing, and we see this from their actions, but we're being told that this is what was going on inside their heads.
Right, and this is more the leadership, but the population. I mean, we saw what took place on college campuses.
Right. They were rejoicing. On October 7th, the protests already started. Before Israel had a chance to respond, they were already protesting against Israel. The rejoicing happened on that day. So, and then the next one is, don't run your mouth. Keep your thoughts to yourself following this day of misfortune. Next, Al-Tave Bishar Ami B'yom Edom. Now, the literal translation would appear to be, don't show up to the gates of my nation on this day of catastrophe. However, the word shar, although it usually means gate, it doesn't only mean gate. Another word for shar means courts. So many times throughout the Bible, throughout the Talmud, the judicial system is known as the shar, because the judiciary was typically, in those days, at the gates of the city. That's where the courts would be held, where there's the biggest flow of traffic, the part that's the most accessible. So when it says Shar Ami with a hyphen, it clearly seems to be saying the courts of nations. You follow?
Right, the United Nations. Is that what you're referring to?
United Nations, UNGA, the ICC, the ICJ, etc., the Security Council, all of that.
Now, what were they doing during this point in time?
So he's saying, don't bring a case against them at the Court of Nations, and and you should not be seen partaking in this evil, which it could be that this part maybe didn't happen just yet. There's some parts that are still not fully unambiguous just yet, because maybe it didn't really play out fully yet. But based on what we know so far, I would assume it means don't take them to the courts of nations, and also don't participate in any evil decisions that the court of nations might choose to pass against the Jewish people.
We don't have to be a prophet to know that is coming, right?
You know what? Either it's going to happen and we'll be like, oh, wow, that's what he meant. Or we're going to find out information that maybe has not yet seen the light of day, that this had already happened a few months ago, but it happened like behind closed doors.
Right. Okay.
Or it could mean something else entirely, but it's not something that's at odds with everything else that we've seen so far.
Right. So far, all the warnings of things that Edom should not do have been done so far.
Correct. Now, the United States has been the only, except for a few island nations in Oceania, but the U.S. has been the one consistent voice of support for Israel at the UN, whereas most European nations have been vociferously against Israel at the UN. And that is something that the majority of the Edom nations have not supported Israel, although the U.S. has. So it's in a way a little bit, it does get a little complex when you consider that sometimes it's more pointed at America, sometimes it's pointed more at the European nations, sometimes it's kind of like a little here, a little there, sometimes it's everybody. But these are specific warnings, and you can violate some of them or all of them, and that is how much you're going to have to answer for. All right. And then the last one of this clause is don't act out against his economic interests. Literally, don't loot his treasure houses, but don't strike against his possessions, I think would be an even more accurate translation, which I would think means don't put sanctions on him. I think would qualify for this prophecy.
Okay. Which has not happened yet against Israel, but
it's happened against individuals in Israel. It hasn't happened against Israel as a whole, but they have announced sanctions against individuals and entities.
Interesting. Okay.
But then again, it most likely is talking about the BDS movement. It's talking about anything that seeks to put financial pressure on Israel. Don't strike out against his financial interests.
You're right. Yeah. As I keep forgetting this, the Edom is the aggregate, the coalition that includes the populace of the United States and all these European nations. You're right. That's been happening.
Look, when they're saying boycott McDonald's and Starbucks, they're not talking about McDonald's and Starbucks in Saudi Arabia. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
And he has two more warnings. Don't stand in middle of the road to cut down the refugees. And don't keep his prisoners locked up unnecessarily following this day of catastrophe. So the second part of the verse seems to be going on the hostages. But the first part of the verse, very interestingly, that the Bnei Yissaschar points out in his commentary, is actually referring to the refugees of our enemies. So he says there will come a time when the nations of Edom will realize the advantageous position that the Jewish people are in, militarily, economically, and they'll say, you know what? It is worthwhile for our bottom line to ally ourselves with them and to wage war together alongside them. But they will use that as a pretext so that when the Jewish people are at the verge of wiping out their enemies, they will get in the way and they will say, sorry, you can't go any further. There are refugees here. So you can't attack. And every time you're about to wipe out your enemies, they will get in the way.
which that has happened precisely.
The first few times I read this in the beginning of the conflict, I said, okay, this is one thing that doesn't seem to be playing out, because look at how supportive the West has been of Israel. Look at how much money they're sending them and weapons, and they're letting them do whatever it takes to defend themselves. And then as soon as the Rafah stuff happened, where for a few weeks they said, no, you can't go into Rafah. When we the analysts were saying that we had them cornered. And the weeks that we spent there kind of going back and forth about it, they had so much time to sneak whoever they wanted out of Gaza through the network of tunnels into Egypt. They had so much time to bring more weapons in through those tunnels. And who knows how much sooner this war could have been over if not for these kinds of unhelpful, underhanded decisions.
Right. And I've seen too that all the humanitarian aid, those trucks coming in, is how Hamas is smuggling in weapons and things to continue to aid them in fighting against Israel.
Listen, the A trucks, they had tunnels that completely circumvented everything. They didn't even need to smuggle into the A trucks. They had these tunnels that were big enough for trucks to drive through.
Okay.
All right. So now that we got the warnings out of the way, he says, Ki karov, for it approaches, Yom Hashem, the day of the Lord, Al Kol HaGoyim, against the nations of Edom. And Al Kol HaGoyim does not mean against all Gentiles. The commentaries explain Al Kol HaGoyim means against the nations of Edom specifically. Kasher Asisa, precisely how you dealt with your Jewish population, Ye'asalach, will be done back to you. Gemulcha Yashav B'Reishcha, you will be dealt measure for measure. So the nations that were benevolent and generous towards the Jewish people, they will be met with benevolence and generosity from God. The ones who throughout history have been seeking to annihilate us are going to be annihilated themselves in precisely the manner that they had sought to annihilate us. And the next verse gets a little metaphorical. Kikasha sasisem al har kachi. Exactly how you drank the goblet on my holy mountain, Yishtu kol hagayim tamid, will these nations be compelled to drink as well. So the way this is explained is that every nation of Edom has a goblet corresponding to them. And every time they caused pain against the Jewish nation, God proverbially dripped the drips of blood that were extracted from the Jewish people. He added the blood into this conceptual goblet.
Okay.
And then in the end of days, he's going to force every nation to drink these goblets at the same time. Again, this is not a literal thing. This is metaphorical. The idea being that all of the pain that they caused us throughout the centuries will be brought out upon them in a very short period of time. All of it is going to happen to them, and they will be destroyed thusly. Bishasu, they will drink. V'la'u, and they will be consumed. V'hayu kaloi hayu. and they will come to a point where it'll be as if they had never existed. Their culture, their advancements, their achievements will all be wiped out as if they never were. And before I explain how we see this playing out,
it sounds like, all these millennia of all these things that Edom has done to the Jewish people, it's all going to be paid back in one moment.
In one moment, or let's say across a single generation, or within a certain very defined period of time, which we're living in right now.
Right. Okay.
And it also, one of the ways of understanding is that once the process starts, it'll be impossible to reverse. So it's not about how long the duration will be. It'll be that once you see the process unfolding, you'll know that they had already reached a point of no return, and their collapse is going to play itself out in a very short period of time from there.
Okay. And we saw this in Ukraine. I mean,
oh, very good. That's one spot. What was the territory of Ukraine known as in association with its Jewish population? That's where the pogroms all started from. That's the Cossacks. The Cossacks were the Ukrainian vanguard, and we've had centuries of history with these people. And what was a pogrom? A pogrom was where you had a bunch of just wild people with pitchforks destroying villages for no reason, killing anybody there, and then forcing the survivors to flee as refugees with whatever they can carry on their backs if they're lucky. And what do we see playing out in Ukraine, if not exactly that? Now, meanwhile, Russia, this is, to me, this is like, it stands out as something very unique that the Russians did against the Jewish people, like a unique evil, which was throughout the 1800s, they had this forced conscription of Jewish boys starting from the age of 10, where they were forcibly conscripted into the Tsar's army for a period of 25 years, where it was designed this way so that they should be ripped away from their families before they're old enough to be able to study and understand Judaism enough to be self-sufficient, and then thrown into these brutal meat grinders, where if they survive 25 years, they're being freed as a 35-year-old who has nothing in common with his heritage, right. And who's also like psychologically traumatized from all the whatever it is that they had been put through throughout those 25 years. They effectively destroyed one of the most thriving Jewish communities in the world. Centuries of Jewish communities were wiped out this way. And we see right now the Russians have lost anywhere between 300,000 and 600,000 of their young men, and I suppose women too, perhaps. But whoever's not being, by the way, at a far, far greater proportion to how many soldiers the Ukrainians have lost. And whoever's going to survive is either going to be so psychologically damaged by the time this is all over. And anyone who was able to just escape Russia fled already. So they are self-destructing in a very similar manner to how they tried to destroy the Jewish people. And the same with Ukraine. But the bulk of the European nations are being destroyed a different way, and that is through assimilation. The nations where over 90% of Judaism was lost to on account of assimilation, nations like France, like Germany, like Italy, those nations are being taken over by foreign elements that are out-assimilating them. And within our lifetime, we are going to witness France stop being French. Germany will no longer be German. It'll be there geographically, but it will not be a land of German people.
Right.
And so the way some of the commentaries explain this, that they will be as if they never were, not that they'll all be wiped out. There will be Western people living in these countries, but they will not identify with any specific culture or any kind of, they won't have any national pride or any sovereignty even. In a way, we saw the beginning of this play out with the formation of the European Union. That sort of ebbed away at their sovereignty, their individuality. And we're seeing through these mass migrations and also the disproportionate number of children between the Europeans and these migrants. And Europe does not have much time left, with a few notable exceptions, one of them being Poland. Poland did not have a big problem with intermarriage on the level that the other nations had. In fact, Poland throughout history, I mean, we remember World War II, but if you consider Poland from like over 800 years, Poland was consistently the safest place for Jews and the most likely part of Europe where Jewish communities could thrive. And they have not yet been overpowered by mass migration. Another nation that perhaps fits this category would be Hungary. Poland and Hungary had the two largest Jewish populations pretty much prior to World War II because of how safe and how accommodating they were comparative to the other Western European nations. So we see that the nations that tried to wipe us out are in the process of being erased themselves. And this is not due to anything proactive that we're doing. This has nothing to do with us. The war in Ukraine and Russia has nothing to do with us. We don't claim Zelensky as representing our interests. Putin does not represent the interests of the Jewish people either. The migrants coming in from North Africa and the Middle East has nothing to do with us, as much as they'll blame some kind of a great replacement theory on as some kind of a Jewish plot. They're just describing a phenomenon that is unfolding, that they're powerless to do anything about, and they're trying to pin it on us. But after millennia of them pinning all of their economic downturns on the Jewish people and whatnot, and any unexplained murder as a blood libel, their era of pinning the blame on the Jew has expired. They're not going to have this kind of influence and credibility at the time of their destruction.
Right. Everything's measure for measure. And the comforting messaging here is, I mean, I want you to continue. I just realized we go in 2 hours. I was only going to take an hour a day. I didn't realize how much time has passed. But that
you said Hashem, an hour, and I said no chance.
But the fact that Hashem it's not Israel engaged in the downfall of these nations. It's clearly Hashem just sort of intervening and measure for measure paying them back for what they've done to us over the millennia.
Exactly. And anybody who wants to say that the Jewish people are somehow behind all of these events at the same time, as if we don't have enough problems ourselves, but that we're orchestrating this, the prophet says, excuse me, I told you about this 2,800 years ago. I warned you. And look, you know what the Western world refers to as, so we call it Shrei Yasar, the 12, right? The 12 books of prophecies.
Yes. Okay.
What does, in the English language, what is this book of 12 prophets known as? The book of 12 prophecies. So they refer to it as the minor prophets.
Okay.
Now, from what I understand, the term is a corruption of what originally was the minor prophecies, as in the short prophecies. But that had gotten corrupted into the minor prophets, which is an entirely different paradigm. The prophets in Shrei Yasar were some of the greatest prophets, in fact, and they were so great that they were able to break down their entire prophecy into a few chapters. They didn't need an entire book to get to the point that they're trying to bring out. For example, Hosea, the first one, was the teacher of Isaiah. So he was no small potatoes.
Okay, I see what you're saying. You're saying that when Christianity annexed our Tanakh to embed it into their Bible, they turned it to diminish the prophetic power of these individuals because they were the ones that are most condemning of them.
I don't think it was done deliberately. I believe there was a corruption that happened through some kind of a divine intervention.
Gotcha.
That perhaps because they don't seem to be as familiar with the minor prophecies as they are with some of the, the Isaiahs, the Jeremiahs, the Ezekiels. And those prophecies are written in very flowery, poetic terms. It's very fun to analyze and break them down, but it's also very hard to understand what they mean in practical terms. A lot of the prophecies in the 12 prophets are very clearly spelled out. And so it's possible that this corruption came about so that as a way of discouraging the Western world from spending too much time analyzing these messages and warnings that have some very clear bearings on world events today. That's my own personal theory.
Well, there's an idea too. I discussed it on an episode a few episodes ago, the Escape from the Exile Edom, about how the church did intentionally mistranslate a lot of the prophets in order to write into it verbiage that pointed to Jesus and a virgin birth and all that stuff.
Yes,
so that corruption was intentional and probably took their eye off the ball when it came to this prophecy that was a direct warning to them.
Right, exactly. So it was always there. It was always out in the open. But the way the Western world regards the prophecy of Obadiah as some kind of a punchline, like, haha, look at this loser who only got a single chapter. He must have been humiliated. I wonder what his mother-in-law thought of him after the Bible came out. Like that is how people look at it. And so I believe that was perhaps by divine design, that they shouldn't really spend too much time on the messaging because they already discredited it. Right?
Right, exactly.
So, and then at the same time, like I said in the beginning, if we were studying this a year ago, we wouldn't have understood this to mean what it means now because it hadn't played out yet. So let's move on to the next part now.
Okay.
Or do you have any questions still?
No. Go ahead and continue.
Okay. So trivia question. While all this is unfolding, where will be the safest place in the world for both Jew and Gentile? Where will be the safest area for people who want to avoid all this carnage to be in?
Israel.
That's right. Ubahar Zion tia pleta. Har Zion, the Mount of Zion, which refers to Jerusalem in particular and Israel as a whole, will be a place of refuge for both Jews and Gentiles. V'haya kodesh, and it will become spiritually holy, that the inhabitants of the land of Israel are going to turn to God and they're going to tap into their spirituality in a way like they have never before. V'yarshu beis Yaakov es shehem, and the house of Jacob will take over their inheritance. The inheritance that God promised to the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be realized at this point in time. The promise that we will get the land of Israel as our eternal inheritance will be fulfilled in an undeniable manner. The Hoya, and at around this point in time, it will come to pass. Beis Yaakov Eish ubeis Yosef Lahava. It breaks down the Jewish people into two distinct classes: the house of Jacob and the house of Joseph. And Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, the 19th century Jewish German philosopher, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of the early modern era.
Yeah,
right?
I've quoted him on this podcast before. I mean, it was the warnings he provided the Jewish people were just so spot on accurate.
Right. So his son wrote a commentary on the 12 prophecies based on his father's teachings. And he says that he breaks down the etymology of a lot of the terms there. That's his, the grammar, the syntax, the precedent, what certain words mean in certain contexts. So he says that the house of Jacob refers to the religious elements of the Jewish people, and the house of Joseph refers to the Jewish people who have been estranged from their religion, but who still proudly identify as Jews. Okay.
Beautiful.
And we see these two classes right now engaged in some kind of, well, not just some kind of, and it's been manifest over various fronts, these conflicts between the right wing and left wing of Israel, the religious, the non-religious, etc. So he says there will be a point of reconciliation between the religious and non-religious. They will work together as a cohesive force. They will be united
Beautiful.
in a way that hasn't happened yet. But he doesn't say if it will happen. He says it will come to pass. V'haya, it will be. Beis Yaakov, the house of Jacob, Aish, will be as if they're a fire. Ubeis Yosef Lahava, the house of Jacob, will be the flame that shoots forth from the fire. So it will be a collaborative effort where the house of Jacob will be engaged in the study of Torah, which is referred to euphemistically as Aish. Religious people will be sacrificing their well-being for the study of Torah. Instead of going out there and making a lot of money and living, a wealthy lifestyle, they will be living just for their basic necessities so that they could study Torah. And this will be at great personal sacrifice. And at the same time, the house of Joseph will be sacrificing themselves physically to protect the Jewish nation. And with these two sacrifices happening simultaneously, you'll see, and by the way, not that this means that all of the religious are going to be studying and all of the non-religious are going to be serving. It means that the house of Joseph's role was to protect Jacob, and Jacob's role was to study the Torah. Originally, Esau was supposed to play that role. He was supposed to protect Jacob, but he failed in his mission. So this was given over to Joseph. So the descendants of Joseph protect, and within the descendants of Joseph, there will be religious. And within the Beis Yaakov, there will be people who are not religious who are trying to study and understand religion better.
Right.
So not that these two classes have to be this way entirely, but this is the representation of the two classes, the Jacob that studies and the Joseph that protects the Jacob. And when both of these classes are unified, Ubeis Esav Lakash, the household of Esau will turn to straw. V'dolku behem v'achlum, they will be lit and they will be consumed. And the commentary explains that why is he comparing Esau to straw? Because straw, just like if one piece of dry straw catches fire, it causes this domino effect where it just spreads to all. We're not going to have to do anything proactively to cause this to happen. It'll be a process that will happen essentially on its own, where the straw is going to obliterate itself and then spread further until the entire house of Esau is wiped out. And the commentaries explain, and the Talmud explains, it doesn't mean that everyone in the Edomite nation will be killed. It means that the evil qualities of Edom will be eliminated. And so that there will be Edom, but they will only be the good of Edom, not the evil.
Right. The ones that grab the sides of our talis and ask us to teach them how to follow the 7 Noahide laws. Well, as you spoke about Jacob and Joseph, I mean, you think about, for one, all the secular Jews waking up, the younger people going to yeshiva. You think about all these ultra-religious Jews joining the IDF.
Right.
Just total congruency with what you just said playing out before our eyes, which is amazing.
Exactly. And so the lo yesrid lebeis Esav, there will not be a survivor of influence among the house of Esau, ki Hashem diber, for Hashem our Lord has guaranteed it. So the West will lose all of its influence over the course of world events from this point on. And then afterwards, he mentions 5 territories that the Jewish people are going to settle once all of this dust settles. And he mentions the precise 5 locations of biblical Israel that are currently not in Jewish hands. And he even refers to the Yashvu HaNegev, they will inherit or they will settle. And HaNegev typically would mean the south or the Negev desert. But the Bnei Yissaschar says HaNegev here is a euphemism for lands controlled by Ishmael. And he says the reason he didn't mention Ishmael by name is because the prophecy is about Edom, and he didn't want to confuse anyone, but who would think, oh, wait a second, this is also about Ishmael. So he refers to Ishmael as Negev, and so we will inherit from Ishmael the following 5 territories. As Har Esav historically is in the on the southern side, southeast of the Jordan River.
Okay.
V'hashfela es haplishtim, the people living in the Shfela, which is geographically the Gaza envelope, will take over the lands, the flatlands of the Plishtim, which is Gaza. And then afterwards, B'yarshu es Sde Ephraim v'Sde Shamron, they will inherit the fields of Ephraim and the fields of Samaria, which the fields of Ephraim is typically known as the Judea and Samaria. U'Binyamin es Gilad, and Benjamin, which is where the capital was situated, Jerusalem, will extend all the way out to Gilead, which is the northeastern side of the Jordan River. So, 2,800 years ago, he's telling us the exact 5 territories that are currently under Arab control, that they are all going to be ceded to the Jewish people.
Beautiful.
Okay. We have 2 more verses. We're almost done.
Okay.
In the next verse, he does something remarkable. He writes prophecies about nations that hadn't even been formed yet at the time of his writing and wouldn't be created for like perhaps a millennium after that. So 28 years ago, he talks about 2 classes of Jews returning from the exile. He says that the Jews are going to start coming back in phases from all over the world. And he says, Ashkenanim that have been forsaken as far away as Sarfas until France. He wrote France by name 2,800 years ago. Like before France was even before Gaul was even recognized as an entity.
Yeah.
And he already had it as the name France. And then Vigalus Yushalayim Asher Besfarad, and the exiles of Jerusalem that are still embedded within Spain. And this, the commentaries explain, is a direct reference to the type of Jews like the ones in Spain post-Spanish Inquisition. That you have Jews in places like Spain and elsewhere that are not aware that they're Jewish because their families have to hide that as a way of self-preservation. Whether that was the right decision or not is not for us to judge, but it happened. You have countless people in these countries that for centuries have been unaware of their Jewish background. They are going to be made aware of their Jewish heritage, and they too will return.
Wow. And, the base dens are so flooded right now with converts, which, was prophesized. And a lot of those are people from this background that said, my grandmother used to light candles on Friday evening.
One of the big operations that the Messiah will, one of the big initiatives of his will be to help all of these people who don't know if they're Jewish or not to determine what their status is, whether, what their background is, and how to place them. This will become a huge effort. Amazing. And every single Jewish soul will be returned over the course of however long this takes to play out. And then the final verse, the Alu Maishim Bahar Tzion, and the bringers of salvation will go up on Mount Zion, Lishpait Eshar Esav, in judgment over the coalition of Esau, which my speculative understanding of this, again, is the UN, that the UN will be brought to judgment alongside all of the powers that try to eliminate us all throughout history, and v'hoisel Hashem hamalucha, and the glory will all be to God.
Beautiful.
Isn't that remarkable?
It's so amazing. I mean, I think that the listeners, to walk away with the fact that, that everything is being orchestrated by your Creator, who loves you and want to get this message, to know that, he is taking care of everything. I see so many Jews. It's like there's definitely an inverse correlation between those who are familiar with their Torah and those who are not, and their level of panic and freaking out with everything that's taking place since, October 7th. Like, you're walking around with your payos, your yarmulke, clearly Jewish, no fear. One that's afraid to put on a yarmulke, that's afraid to let everyone know their last name is Goldman or something, they're in the most panic, and they don't understand that's because they don't understand that Hashem's controlling all this in their best interest in the end.
I had a conversation last night with a close friend of mine. We were eating Lava Malka together. That is the feast to, how would you describe it?
Go ahead. You probably describe better than I can.
So after the Sabbath, we sit down to a feast as a way of saying goodbye to the Sabbath and also to console ourselves, because during the Sabbath, we were in a very spiritually elevated state. And now we're going back to the mundane and the very cruel and dark world. So, we need a little something to push us through. So we sit down, we eat a meal, and we kind of acknowledge the departure of the Sabbath. And it's like a transitional point to get us back into the week.
Yeah.
So I had a few friends over, and one of them was telling me that when he walks in the street on Shabbos with his kids, he puts on a baseball cap, because the abuse that he receives from just anti-Semitic, people in cars roll down the windows, they'll scream out like some curses and just drive off. He said he doesn't want his kids to be exposed to this.
Sure.
So when he's in the street with his kids, he puts on a baseball cap so that, this way he's able to. So I said, I take the exact opposite approach, because I want my kids to see how a Jew hater behaves. And when they say you bleeping Jew, let them associate this kind of language with our haters. Let them know that these are words that bad people use. These are not words that we use. And second of all, what do these people do when they roll down their windows? They scream out some expletives. Most of the time, you can't even hear what they're saying, because they're in such a rush to drive off. They say what they say, and go back to Auschwitz, and then they just speed off, right?
Right.
I said, look at how frightened they are of me. They see a religious Jew, they hate me enough that they'll scream something out, and then they'll floor the gas.
Right.
Despite the fact that I'm the most harmless, most pacifistic individual out there, I couldn't couldn't even prick Hitler without feeling guilty. Like that's how gentle of a soul I would do it. I would prick him. I would prick him repeatedly. But it would make me feel uncomfortable. I would wish that there could be somebody else who could inflict pain on him, because I'm just too gentle and soft, right?
Right. Yes.
And yet they are petrified of me. And this is something that it has some deep meaning behind it. If you're doing the right thing and you're not afraid of who you are,
yes,
then they're afraid of you. But if you're afraid of them, then that gives them then they no longer fear you.
100%. 100%.
Look, people, be safe. We live in very scary times. I'm not trying to minimize that. I'm not trying to minimize the threat we face. Ultimately, the Jewish people are going to move to Eretz Yisrael with Mashiach. That is what is going to happen at some point down the line. So we're not going to be stuck in this state forever. It's a transitional point, and it's designed to make us cognizant of who we are and what our role is and what our responsibility is. And if you're wondering, why do they hate me so much? I never did anything to them. I'm just like them. Then that should be a clue for you maybe to not be so much like them. Maybe take pride in your heritage. Be safe, be smart, don't provoke people unnecessarily. Be respectful to everyone. Don't get into shouting matches with these kinds of people. Accept that they have a role to play here, and that they're essentially pawns of God.
That's sometimes giving us a message from him when he needs us to return to who we truly are in our role here.
Yep.
And look, and there's an idea too which is reality, is that if you live in the reality, the true reality, that nothing can happen to any of us unless our Creator allows it to happen, who dictates that should happen. If you live in that reality, that's the reality you live in. If you want to live in reality that everything's just randomness, then that's the world you live in. It's your choice.
Exactly.
Jake, I am so thankful that you were willing to spend 2.5 hours with me.
Yeah, Dan, listen, Dan, this has become this has become my life's mission to spread these words. So when you reached out to me, the way I look at it was like God sent you as a messenger to spread this message to your audience. And so who am I to say no, and who am I to limit it to any like time frame? This has to be done right. It has to be done in a way where people can understand it. And if there's anything that's been left unexplained, if anything isn't clear, then I'm sure there's some kind of a way for them to get in contact with you, and we can clarify these things.
Yes.
But it has to be done right.
Yes. Exactly.
Right.
I'm so thankful. Yes. You can always email me, shma@torchweb.org. If you have any questions, and I will forward it to Jake. And yeah, when I heard this on the Kids Club podcast, I was like, I need to get this out, distribute it to my audience. It's too important. It's a letter from Hashem to every Jew alive today. They have a right to get this message. And I'm so thankful that you took the time to deliver it in a way that those of us who are less educated could understand this.
Well, I would say absolutely, except to the less educated part, because my understanding is that you have a very highly educated audience. Anybody who was not born from to embrace Judaism in its most extreme and authentic form, which is not easy even for us who were born into it, but for someone to do this on their own as an adult, these people are on the highest pedestal of respect as far as Judaism goes. Because like the analogy I gave in about Esau, being born on top of a mountain does not make you great. Being born into a civilization that's already achieved everything for you is not a sign of greatness. A sign of greatness is where you take your own initiative and you go through a process that is so humbling and so challenging and takes over your life. There is no greater ambition than this. And so not only is your audience far better educated than what you said would otherwise perhaps suggest, but it is something that I am humbled by.
Thank you, Jake. And now I have a very mixed audience, but I'm out. And like I said, I never opened a Torah. I was an atheist at the age of 40. I'm now 55. Yeah, many listeners are just beginning their learning. It is an arduous journey, but those who reach out to me, they're pushing and forging ahead every day, learning more, doing more, picking up another mitzvah that we're not familiar with. We're all Klei Yisrael. We're all fighters. And it's a very symbiotic relationship between the from births and us Baal Teshuva, because you're there to teach us what we didn't know, and we tend to bring a little enthusiasm to our learning and what you're teaching us. And I've read a lot about that. That's all by divine providence as well. It's exactly the way Hashem wanted it to. As the prophecy said, the fire of Jacob and the flame of Joseph to come together and really, ignite our passion for one another, Hashem and His Torah. Again, just love the message you shared with us. So thank you so much.
Be gebenched, as we would say in Pseudo-Yiddish.
Beautiful. All right.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting Torch so they can continue to spread Torah wisdom to the world by making a donation at torchweb.org and clicking donate in the top right corner of the page.